you gonna teach us anything?
What, you want me to teach you something? You want to learn something? All right. You got it!
Hello and welcome to Atomi Brainwaves. I'm your host Simon and I'm joined today by Sue. What's up, Sue?
Not a lot, Simon. How are you?
You ready for the last recording of the day? I won't say how many we've done today, but I'll just say this is the last.
Yeah, rearing to go.
Ready and raring to go. That's what I like to hear. We are recording here in the studio at Atomi HQ. What is Atomi? It's an online resource for second-level education, platform used by students and teachers alike to help make education awesome and engaging. We provide content for schools and students in Australia and the UK in the form of short, digestible, syllabus-specific videos and classroom activities. Unsurprisingly then, ours is a podcast about education for educators. We take a look at some key issues in the world of education, and today we're doing so with the help of our resident teaching expert, former head of English, digital learning leader for curriculum and pedagogy, and director of curriculum, Sue. Today, we are taking a look at blended learning, a subject close to your heart, I believe, Sue.
Absolutely.
Yes, big fan.
Yep.
So, straight off the bat, let's dive into blended learning and what it actually means, because there's a few misinterpretations out there of what the term actually means. I was wondering if you could clear it up for us and give us a clear definition.
Sure. Well, maybe.
We'll try. We'll try anyway.
In its broadest sense, so I think misinterpretations are probably where it gets very narrowed down, but in its broadest sense, it's a style of education in which students learn via electronic and online media as well as face-to-face teaching. So it's just a kind of term that encapsulates bringing technology into your face-to-face teaching for different purposes. But it does mean that for some aspects of the education, you are learning face-to-face, generally in a bricks and mortar environment, in our case, K-12, in a school environment.
Okay, well, that's a pretty concise definition.
There you go.
In the broader sense.
Practice that one.
Yes. Unfortunately, now we are going to get down into the narrow, murkier waters. And I was hoping you could outline for us some of the most popular or useful forms that a blended classroom can take.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think at its heart, a blended classroom gives a greater range of opportunities to students than perhaps previously. So it's like, think of it as like an expansion of the classroom, so that kids have an increased accessibility to content, in some ways to the teacher if you've got the content deliverable online. They have some control over pace, place, some style of delivery, some choice. So real blended learning, think of it as a bit of a spectrum, and some blended learning activities can really rely on that sense of choice. So the teacher has curated a lot of material, I guess, for a student, and they choose their way through it, like a choose your own adventure kind of thing. But in terms of, so that sort of contextualizes broadly. In terms of, like you said, more narrowly, a couple of models that I've done myself. Flex model is one that really relies on students working at their own pace through predetermined set of material. So that the content is mostly online, but you're still in a traditional school setting. So this is your flex model. In that model, teachers act as the guide for students through the learning process, and they provide sort of individual or group help to the students. Now, I've done this for a term. I've done it for several terms at different times, but generally with Flex, I do it for like a term or a unit's length at a time. And the one that I think of when I recall this one is the creative writing module that I did, 6-week module, did fully Flex model, and then just ran workshops in the class for students who needed particular help with particular styles of writing. And that varied considerably because it was very individual what their creative writing abilities were. So that's the Flex model. A model that works really well, often lower down the school or where you don't have necessarily one-to-one access to technology. And there's a model called rotation, which is either station rotation or lab rotation. And in a sort of station rotation, students move between learning stations, as it says, station rotation.
That makes sense.
Yeah. But groups of students essentially move through a lessons or sequence of lessons, and they're engaged in online learning whilst teacher facilitates activities at different stations. Now, that works really well in, say, maybe you've got a primary classroom It's not one-to-one technology, but you've got, say, 7 iPads, something like that. So you've got a desk set up with the iPad activity, and kids move. They use the online learning for that particular activity. Then they move to the next station, which might be the teacher teaching them how to write a great structured sentence, for example. Then they move to the next activity. So they're rotating around to different activities. Requires a lot of setup, obviously.
You
You'd
can imagine,
Yeah.
yes. Particularly with younger students.
Yeah, well, actually, the setup's the same.
Well, yes, of course.
But yeah, I think the discipline might be different, because they've got to obviously be self-directed in some of the different stations. So that's sort of like a rotation model. Again, the teacher is doing small group instruction, individual tuition or sort of projects, that sort of thing. And it's very, at a further end of blended learning is flipped. So I know we spoke about that on some other podcasts, but that's where the delivery of content is taken external to the classroom, and students come to the lesson prepared for the lesson time to be about application and not about receiving content. And the online world often comes into that because you might be using your LMS or a content platform like Atomi to deliver the content externally to the teacher, sort of thing, and then bring in the content that they've learned into lesson to do the application.
Yeah, awesome.
So 3 there: flipped, flex, and rotation.
Yeah, and it really good systems kind of, and really gives you an idea of the broad mandate that blended learning covers, different systems falling under the same umbrella group, but all following along similar ethos, similar lines. And in that sort of idea of broader context, to move back into that, I just wanted to explore a little bit specifically what the value of blended learning is, kind of what it came maybe in reaction to, and the value that adopting one of the blended learning systems that you've outlined can bring to a student.
Well, for me, I think I've always been a sort of technology advocate, but purposeful, not just like the latest app or doing it for the sake of doing it. So I think for me, using blended learning actually gives you sort of a real authentic use of technology in the classroom. And with I've been teaching 17 odd years, 18.
You never seem to be able to
I
quite
can't work
nail
it
that
out. I
number
need to work it out. 2002, I started teaching.
Okay.
Yeah, 17.
We'll let the maths wizards out there crunch the numbers.
So in that time, there's been drastic changes in technology, obviously. And I think the students of today, technology is such a part of their world that, teachers need to incorporate it into their teaching and learning. And where we fail to do that, we're actually not setting them up for a life external to school as well. So I think one of the sort of issues, I guess, that we were talking about in the first question you posed here was to actually give an authentic use for technology in the classroom. Some of the other issues that I think blended learning also tackles, because of the different aspects that you can have going on in the classroom at the same time, is it helps with differentiation, because the teacher can be almost working with different groups, which you can in a non-blended method, but I think it's easier in a blended method because you've got stuff for the students to do online whilst you're working with maybe a smaller group. I think it helps incredibly with engagement. As I said, students are used to working with computers, and so there's a level of engagement that comes from that itself. And I think that sort of connectivity that students are so used to nowadays, if we're not providing learning in a connective way, then it's almost remote to the rest of their existence, So I think adding that sort of sense of connectivity. And then we often see, in terms of English, we'd often have large class sizes. So class sizes of between 25 and 33, depending on school maximums, minimums kind of thing, which brings a variety of needs in a class. And in a blended model, I find it easier to cater for those needs because you're almost duplicating yourself as a teacher. So by curating content that they can do online, or activities or work they can do online, as well as being face-to-face with some students, you kind of duplicated what you can do.
Awesome. Yeah, plenty of value there, I guess, for a student. To bring us back, we talked a little on the top about the idea of misconceptions around the term blended learning, But another area where there are a lot of misconceptions is around the role of the teacher in a blended learning classroom.
Yeah.
One of the stones that's maybe thrown at blended learning is, people claiming that, this, what's the teacher for? It brings them out of the equation. Most people, however, who are in the know would argue the exact opposite is the case. Could you talk us through a teacher's role in a blended classroom and their value there?
Yes, certainly. I mean, that's the sort of criticism that's also thrown at self-directed learning. Probably more so at self-directed, because people then think, what's the point in the teacher if the kid's directing all their own learning? But it does translate also into blended learning, because really in a blended learning classroom, if you're walking past it, you generally won't see the teacher delivering from the front. You certainly will at some points. And when I teach in a blended method, there are definitely points in a sequence of lessons where I'm delivering a workshop, I'm teaching from the front, etc. But a lot of the time you'll see me sat down next to students or curating a group of students into some sort of activity. So I think the role of the teacher kind of looks different, but it's actually even more complex than a chalk and talk teacher, because you are orchestrating an entire range of activities at any one point in the lesson. You're orchestrating a range of differentiated activities as well. If you're going with the flex model, or even with mastery learning, where kids are progressing through at a pace where they have mastered something, they're moving on, then there's an awful lot of preparation involved in that, into, like perhaps within your LMS actually, when I've done mastery learning within an LMS, actually putting in prerequisites of learning, and then it opens up like a Pandora's box to the next thing, more prerequisites to that, then the next thing. It's really orchestrating a learning journey, and there's so much more in that than your traditional chalk and talk. So the role of a teacher is hugely important. You're the curator of all these different aspects, and it's actually quite draining in the classroom as well, because you've got so much going on.
Yeah. You can almost,
really engaging, but quite draining.
Yeah, I mean, you could almost say that the chalk and talk model is almost a structure that's set up to make it as easy for the teacher as possible, whereas a lot of the blended learning systems that you're talking about is, obviously it's not designed to make it hard for the teacher, but it is designed to make it as easy and accessible as possible for the student.
Yeah.
Which, the flip side, then puts a whole lot extra responsibility on the teacher to make sure that those systems stay in place.
Yeah, and that's why things like collective teacher efficacy comes into play, because if you've got other teachers helping to build what it is that your class or several classes are working through, then that's hugely helpful in terms of
building the resources.
Yeah, building the resources, mapping out what journey or what this looks like for a class. Or for a group of classes. And then, the teacher isn't doing it all themselves, but they're working on a team to do it. So it's great, like if you can, in some non-teaching time, which we call holidays, but it's actually, teachers are actually contracted 4 weeks of holiday a year, but it's non-teaching time. So you'll often get executive staff telling teachers, no, this isn't your holiday, this is your non-teaching time. You should be building content, you should be marking, you should be, etc. And they're just
might not be what every teacher wants to hear,
right
but yes.
But if you can get together in some of that planning and preparation time and build what is a term's worth of what you're going to do in the blended learning classroom, then it's, it doesn't kind of work, I guess, if you're trying to chase your tail, is what I'm saying. It's got to be hugely prepared and planned. But it's vastly rewarding when you have done that, in the relationships and the depth of learning that you can get from your students. It just can't be done on a whim, Can't be done as you walk into class.
No, absolutely not. We've touched on so far the differences and advantages, disadvantages between blended learning and the traditional classroom model. I was wondering if we could zero in on that and kind of do a comparison between, blended learning in general, or even a specific system if you prefer, and traditional explicit chalk and talk classrooms, and just kind of analyze what the benefits of introducing a blended system are versus that older model.
Well, I think advantages are that students can move at their own pace, which gives them greater opportunity for moving their surface knowledge into sort of a deeper learning realm. And I think as they do that, that's helping them with a whole heap of soft skills as well, like resilience, helping them with things like determination and decision making, that sort of things, particularly if you've allowed them choice in what material it is that they're accessing, prepares them for sort of much more autonomous or self-directed learning, which is really going to help as they go through school for study time and things like that. So I think an advantage is how it can engage students. Like, we all like to have some freedom over what we're doing and when we're doing it. And so we shouldn't think that an 11-year-old is any different. You know, they like to have choice. From a teacher's point of view, I think more time in application in the classroom allows you to move learning from that surface deep into the transfer sort of state, because you can actually be working with kids in much more depth, because you're not just teaching from the front. You know, you're next to them, helping them. So you can transfer learning. So I always, when I've presented on blended learning, I always talk about how your teacher time is repurposed. And it's almost like you are cloning yourself. So if you have done what I sort of mentioned earlier about curating your content and getting it ready before the unit of work, then your time and energy isn't the night before trying to prepare the next lesson. It's actually working with the students, what they've done in terms of the lesson, in terms of application and things like that. So that repurposing of teacher time for me is really important. And then I think another advantage is just it's engaging. You know, like a kid in a blended learning classroom, there's a variety of things happening. They've got choice. They're generally allowed to move around, which is a big deal still in some classrooms. You know, they've got
you
some
think
freedom.
of older where you have to sit in the same spot which particularly for younger children is so difficult.
Hard. So I just think it adds that sense of engagement and variety, and because they've got some level of autonomy as well, they're more likely to come to the party. You know. Yeah. Disadvantages, you were saying. It is exhausting for teachers.
Of course.
Which is funny, because you'd think like a chalk and talk lesson would be more exhausting because you're just at the board delivering the content. But in many ways, you can do that off once you've become an experienced teacher.
You go into autopilot.
You can do that quite easily. So I guess it's mentally exhausting just having so many things on the go at once, but it is rewarding at the same time, you know. So in that way, it's kind of not for the faint-hearted. But I think a blended classroom is likely to be quite different to a normal classroom. So, or a traditional classroom, it's likely to be louder, students moving around, more inquiry-based, sort of more curious, and that gives a different type of atmosphere. Still can be totally switched on to learning, but it's not going to be your sort of listen to me, work through, quite quiet kind of atmosphere. So in some ways that can be quite tiring, I guess.
Yeah.
That also can be quite tiring for particular types of students. So you do need to watch those in the mix as well. You know, those more kind of reserved students who quite like the quiet times. So, and another disadvantage which would actually be technology itself. So you do need a certain, there are ways around it, of course, there always are with tech, but you do need a certain sense of a scaffold or a backbone or something like that to where your blended learning is going to sit. So you can have things with connectivity issues, like it all falls down if your Wi-Fi doesn't work, for example, you know.
It's the same in anywhere in the world at this point. Wi-Fi goes.
Yeah, Wi-Fi
civilization
goes.
stops.
Exactly. It can be expensive. It doesn't have to require a one-to-one device because you can use the station rotation model, but it is often easier if it's one-to-one. That in less wealthy schools, that can provide issues with equity. You know, so you got a few things like that. You might have some students who don't have Wi-Fi access at home, you know, if you're in, say, a rural school. So you got to make sure that with what you do, it still makes a level playing field for everybody.
And I guess it's about being, from what I'm hearing from these challenges, it's about being a little bit adaptable with it too.
Yeah.
And for instance, the challenges you were talking there around Wi-Fi, tweaking the approach in order to best fit the class, as opposed to the other way around and saying, oh, I love this blended classroom, and then trying to shoehorn it in when not everything is in place for it to work. And
that's like, I used to work in a school in Dural, and there was one kid who did not have Wi-Fi because it just didn't have the internet, didn't go to the end of his road because he lived. You
can tell off the last recording of the day.
He lived further out into away from school. And so for him, when we were doing activities that were requiring at home, we had to either download them before he went or print them out. And it was like I had to remember to do that or else it wasn't fair on him, you know.
Course, yeah.
So I think you have to just make sure that when you are setting that, you're aware of all the limitations and all the possibilities. So, yeah, I think the advantages way outweigh the disadvantages, but there are things to be aware of.
Yeah, definitely. Challenges, but challenges that can be overcome
Yeah.
are worth overcoming.
Yeah.
In terms of, we've talked about the value and value in the overarching sense of what blended learning can bring. I want to get a bit specific in terms of that and ask where you think a blended classroom can add the most value. By what I mean by that is, are there any subjects that lend themselves particularly to a blended classroom? Is there an age range of students that suit it more? Classroom size? Are bigger classrooms better? Are smaller classrooms? That kind of thing. The specific makeup of a class that suits a blended classroom. Or would you say that it doesn't matter?
Oh, no, any subject and any age range, I think you can do. There's been an awful lot of work done in the States by Caitlin Tucker and Heather Staker and Michael Horn, providing loads of examples of where blended learning works brilliantly in primary schools, particularly Caitlin Tucker. And they're training students in that model. You know, a bit like we were talking about in a different podcast about inquiry learning in K-6 and then continuing that into senior school. So I think it doesn't matter on the age of the kid or the subject. It just matters on how you tailor that to meet their needs, you know, which you're going to do anyway with anything. But the classroom is an interesting one. Last year when I was doing my master's, I spent a lot of time on looking at redesigning of classroom spaces for blended learning. And I think sort of came to this theory through a lot of academic reading, really, that the physical space actually acts as a third teacher. So if you think you've got your teacher, one teacher, your online space is a second teacher, and then your physical space is a third teacher. And the physical space, when your kids come to a class, that determines your expectations for that class. If a kid comes to the class and it's in rows and you're standing at the front, what message are you giving to those students? You're very much giving a message of transmission, of you're here to soak this in, etc. I am the font of all knowledge. I'm at the front of the room. You're in rows. And that doesn't work for a blended classroom. So when I was working at Barker, we actually put in a bid that we won to create a blended learning classroom as a prototype. And we were using David Thornburg's 1997 book called Campfires in Cyberspace as a kind of guide. And he puts 3 metaphors forward for learning. One of those is a cave, which is where kids go to do individual kind of deep work, reflection, that sort of stuff. Another one is a watering hole, where you have discussion time, group time, like animals gathering around a water hole kind of thing, time together. And then the last one is campfires, time spent listening and learning from an expert. So a bit like, you're gathered around a campfire, one person's telling the story and you're all listening. So those are his 3 metaphors for learning. And if a blended classroom is set out around those so that you're allowing flexibility, movement, so kids can go, okay, I'm going to do this activity that's best suited for a cave. I'm going to find that silent space, that quiet space, so I can reflect and do this deep kind of work, maybe an essay or whatever it is that they're trying to really concentrate on. This is a group task, so I'm going to gather around a pod or a podium and we're going to work here together. So they've got that choice, but they've also got the space that allows them to dictate that choice. And that, I think, is very, very powerful. So in terms of classroom size, I don't think like a large or a small class matter, but the space of the classroom matters in the way that it dictates the learning. What I often used to do was get to a class early, change the rows into groups. Very exhausting because you've got to get there early. You've got to put it back at the end.
Yeah, the actual physical effort before you even get into
and then, so it's lovely if you timetabled into a space that is like that. And most schools have some spaces like that. So if you are going to go down the sort of blended learning route, I would be an advocate to get yourself into one of the newer designed learning spaces where you can sort of do that at ease, because it is another teacher in your classroom. Yeah,
it makes sense. And it maybe would be something that most people wouldn't think of straight away, the physical space. But now that you outline it the way you have, it really does have an impact, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, it just sets the kids up for what they're expecting. And yeah, it's very hard to say to a child, I'm going to come and work individually with you, and you can't even get behind the rows to come and do that, So you want to be able to have the flexibility to move around. If you've got tables that are on wheels, fantastic, because you can just really agile, put different groups together, space things around. If you've got a nice little space where you can sit with a group of 5 kids, you often see like half moon tables where a teacher can sit in the middle and put kids around the outside. Just for the benefit of everyone listening, I'm trying to draw that with my fingers for Simon.
You're doing a fantastic job of that. Unfortunately, it might not translate over the airwaves.
But the teacher almost sits like a bartender, I guess, in the middle, or and they're sat around you. But anything like that just allows you to do that group space, that interaction with people on a smaller scale, rather than the whole class, I guess.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Bringing it out of the idea of blended learning within the classroom into the wider discourse, as we tend to do towards the end of our podcasts, I wanted to ask, in terms of the discussion around blended learning in the education world, where do you think the prevailing wind is blowing? Is it more so in favor, more so against? Are things slowly changing to more and more people being open to blended classrooms, progress slow? Where do you think we are at this point?
Yeah, I think it's growing much more positive. I think people's sort of view on technology in itself is changing quite a bit anyway. That it's become such a backbone of schools. Like teachers using emails all the time, students, it's pretty commonplace that they've either got Google Classrooms or an LMS, or they've got something that they submit work to, that kind of thing. So I think it's becoming much more positive. Some models like Flex and Flipped are not widely adopted. I think teachers tend to be creatures of habit, and it's quite hard to let go of content delivery. And so they aren't as widely used as perhaps just at its very base incorporating technology into the classroom. When you start looking at different models, like I'm going to do this model, that then changes to much more of a blended learning rather than just the very basic definition that we gave at the beginning. But I've done both Flex and Flips for different terms and for different modules, and it's really encouraging when you do see your students working in different ways and you give them the opportunity to kind of show you what they can do, show you how they can be responsible for themselves, I guess. One of the things that filters down is what happens at universities into K-12. So in universities, the blended is being offered more and more, I think. I think you'd be hard pressed to find a uni now that is not working on blended learning, in the sense that you've got your face-to-face, you go into uni and you actually have your face-to-face material, but so much of it is also online.
Yeah, even if they're not branding it as blended learning, that is what's happening.
That is what's happening, yeah. And I guess online learning is greatly utilised now, so online being different to blended, but if you take online content and use some of it in a face-to-face way, that's where your blend is, So I think that sense of it filtering down and being a way of authentically incorporating technology into teaching is, not as difficult as it used to be. And I think, content providers like ourselves are helping teachers to make the content. So it's easier to, if you plug in, say, Atomi content, you are much easier to do a flip or a flex, because you're not making the content for yourself, which is incredibly time consuming. And then you can focus on the deeper level of application and that sort of stuff. So I think looking at external resources to help you as you blend your learning is really important too.
Very important to the process. There you go. Well, the winds of change are blowing. The rising tide of blended learning is taking over the world. Maybe not quite, but on the way, maybe.
Yeah. It's doing well.
It's doing well.
Yeah.
Doing well, motoring along. So that is all we have time for in terms of blended learning. However, before we go, as always, we're going to get Sue's hot tip for the week. This is a little piece of advice. Maybe it's a little anecdote or story for teachers out there. Doesn't have to be that serious. Doesn't even have to necessarily be about education at all. Just a little something from Sue to bookend the episode. Yeah. So Sue, let's say his hot tip.
Okay. So think which you prefer, flip or flex. Pick one of them and have a go. Flip or flex. There you
I
go.
almost felt you were asking me for a second there.
Well, you
I was
can
like,
do.
well, I won't be leading any
What would you
classes
prefer,
anytime
to
soon.
flip or to flex?
I'll have to think about it.
But yeah, I just encourage you to actually try one of the models. Like it's quite invigorating to, change your teaching practice. And, I'm not sort of saying you have to do it forever. But, maybe pick a class where you think they are becoming a little bit disengaged and could do with something different. You've got the long summer break now. So obviously your classes are out, but you'll know the kids that you've got coming up next year and you've got time to plan. So maybe think, okay, I'm going to try something a bit different and have the courage to have a go.
There you go. Flip or flex.
Flip or flex.
Get on it. Alrighty. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in and listening to us. And thank you to Sue.
Pleasure.
And looking forward to having you back in whatever weird and wonderful area of the education world we are in next. Until such time, check us out at our main site at getatomy.com. For now, it's goodbye from Sue.
Bye.
And goodbye from me. See ya.